They left a wounded female sniper. In minus 71 degrees, Cold SEAL medics arrived, couldn't believe she was alive. The hand was the first thing they saw. It broke through the surface of the snow like something that refused to stay buried. The fingers were locked, rigid, curled around the stock of a Barrett MO-82A1 in a grip so tight that the men who found it would later say they couldn't tell where the rifle ended and the woman began. The temperature that night was negative 71 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. Engines fail, radios cut out. The human body, which has spent millions of years learning how to survive, almost everything begins the quiet process of giving up. She had been out there for 31 hours. The medic who reached her first pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck and held his breath. The rest of the team stood in a half circle behind him, their headlamps cutting pale columns through the Arctic dark. Nobody spoke. The wind moved across the Brooks Range the way it always did in January, not in gusts, but in one long, unbroken push, like the land itself was trying to exhale every living thing off its surface. The medic looked up. "She's still gripping it," he said. "How is that even possible?" Nobody had an answer, and that question, that one quiet, disbelieving question spoken into the Alaskan dark, is where the story ends. But it is not where it begins. To understand how Sloan Mercer ended up alone in a snow trench at the top of the world, still holding on, still breathing, you have to go back 10 days. You have to go back to the moment she stepped off a transport plane at Iselson Air Force Base and walked into a room full of men who had already decided before she opened her mouth exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth. Iselson Air Force Base sits about 26 miles southeast of Fairbanks, Alaska. In January, the base exists in a kind of permanent twilight. The sun rises late and sets early and spends the hours in between hovering just above the horizon like it cannot quite commit to being there. The cold is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply is a presence so total and so indifferent that after a few days you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of your own heartbeat. Sloan Mercer noticed it. She always noticed things other people stopped paying attention to. She was 26 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 118 pounds on a heavy day. She had the kind of face that made people in airports assume she was a college student heading home for the holidays. Brown hair pulled back, gray-green eyes that tended to stay still, even when the rest of her was moving a jaw that sat a little too square to be pretty in the conventional sense, but that gave her face a quality of permanence, like something carved rather than assembled. She carried her own gear off the transport. All of it. Nobody offered to help. That was fine. She didn't need help. She needed to find Briefing Room C before 0800, and she needed to do it without asking anyone for directions because she had already studied the base layout on the flight up from Joint Base Lewis McChord, and she knew exactly where she was going. She found the room at 0756. She was the first one there. The mission briefing lasted 40 minutes. The team that filtered in over the following 10 minutes was 6 men and 1 retired civilian advisor. Sloan sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded in front of her, and she watched each of them come through the door the way she watched everything. Not with suspicion, just with attention. There is a difference. Suspicion narrows your vision. Attention expands it. Master Chief Garrett Rourke came in last. He was 52 years old, built the way old architecture is built, solid without waste, designed to outlast the things around it. He had spent 22 years as a Navy SEAL. He had gray at his temples, and a scar along his left jawline that had faded to white, and a way of moving through a room that suggested he had already calculated 3 exits before he sat down. He looked at the briefing packet. He looked at the map on the wall. Then he looked at Sloan. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The mission was a 10-day reconnaissance patrol into the Brooks Range, the mountain chain that runs east to west across the northern interior of Alaska, like a spine, remote and immense and largely untouched. The objective was to surveil a series of supply routes suspected of being used for equipment transfer by a foreign-linked organization that had been operating in the region for the better part of 2 years. No direct engagement expected, no fire support on standby. This was a watching mission, a listening mission. Eyes and ears, nothing more. Sloan's role was officially designated as Navy Corpsman, the combat medic of the Naval Special Operations world. She had been assigned to provide medical support for the duration of the patrol. That was her job. That was what the paperwork said. Petty Officer First Class Calloway read the paperwork. Then he looked across the table at Sloan. Then he looked at Rourke. "This is the doc," he said. He didn't say it quietly. Calloway was 34, broad across the shoulders with close-cut blonde hair and the kind of blunt confidence that comes from being the best at something for long enough that you forget other people exist on the same scale. He was good at his job. He knew he was good at his job. He had a way of making that knowledge visible at all times, the way some men wear their watches on the outside of their sleeve. Rourke didn't respond to the question. He turned a page in the briefing packet. Sloane didn't respond either. She had expected the question. She had expected the tone. She wrote a note in the margin of her own briefing packet and kept her eyes on the page. Chief Petty Officer Hargrove, sitting 2 seats to her left, glanced at her once. He was 45, lean, where Calloway was broad with dark eyes that moved slowly and missed very little. He had the quality of a man who had learned early that the most important information in any room is usually the information nobody is talking about. He watched Sloane write her note. He watched her not react to Calloway. He filed both things away without comment. Petty Officer Decker, 24 years old, the youngest member of the team, kept his eyes forward and said nothing. He had only been with the platoon for 7 months. He had learned that the best way to survive the first year was to watch more than he spoke. He watched Sloane the way Hargrove watched Sloane, but with younger eyes, which meant he saw the same things and understood fewer of them. Retired Warrant Officer Harlan Cole sat at the far end of the table and said nothing at all. He was 63, weather-worn, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades reading landscapes for a living. He had operated in Alaska for more years than some of the men in this room had been alive. Rourke had requested him specifically. Cole knew the Brooks Range the way other men know their own neighborhood, not from maps but from memory, from 40 winters of learning what the land does when it decides it doesn't want you there anymore. Cole looked at the map. He looked at Sloane. Something crossed his face, not recognition exactly, but a careful attention, the quality you give a detail in a landscape that doesn't quite fit the pattern around it. Then the briefing ended and everyone stood and Sloane picked up her pack. Calloway passed her on the way to the door. "You'll want to stay behind the wire on this one, Doc," he said. Not meanly, almost friendly, the kind of friendly that comes wrapped in condescension so practiced it no longer recognizes itself. "Leave the heavy lifting to the big boys." Sloane adjusted the strap on her pack. "Yes, sir," she said. Calloway wasn't a sir. He knew she knew that. She said it anyway, and somehow that was worse for him than any other response she could have given. He walked out without saying anything else. Hargrove passed her next. He paused for exactly 1 second. "Gear inspection is at 1300, he said. "You know what you're doing with that med kit?" "Yes, Chief." He nodded once, moved on. It wasn't warmth, but it was something. The patrol departed Eielson on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January. They flew northeast by helicopter and were dropped at a forward staging point 80 miles from the first surveillance position. From there, they moved on foot. The Brooks Range in January does not offer comfort. It offers honesty. Every piece of equipment that isn't properly maintained shows its failure within hours. Every gap in physical conditioning announces itself on the first real climb. Every mistake in cold weather layering becomes apparent before the first night is over. The land has no patience for approximation. It requires precision, and it requires it without negotiation. Sloane spent the first 3 hours closing the distance between training and the actual thing, adjusting her pace to the terrain, reading the way the wind came off the ridgelines, watching the team move and noting who favored their left knee and who checked their compass too often, and who moved through ground cover like they owned it. Rourke moved through it like he owned it. She noted that too. The first day passed without incident. The second day passed the same way. Sloane treated a blister on Decker's left heel at the end of day 2, cleaned it, dressed it properly, told him to change his sock liner in the morning. He thanked her with the mild embarrassment of a young man being taken care of by a woman roughly his own age. She moved on before he could make it awkward. On the evening of day 2, she sat outside the shelter for 20 minutes after the others had gone in. The temperature was -38. She had her balaclava up and her goggles down, and she sat facing north toward the ridge they would cross in the morning. She found the ridgeline. She traced it with her eyes left to right, noting the low point, noting the exposed sections, noting the place where the wind would hit them hardest. She did not think about what she was doing. It was not a conscious act. It was the way her mind moved through a landscape, always measuring, always calculating, always filing the numbers somewhere quiet and interior where they would be waiting when she needed them. Distance lived in the texture of snow at range, in the compression of detail while at altitude, in the geometry of shadow at low angles. She had been reading terrain this way since she was 10 years old, and the knowledge had long since passed below the level of thought into something closer to reflex. Cole, sitting with his back against a snow anchor 15 feet away, watched her watch the ridge. He didn't say anything. He just watched. Day 3 changed things. It didn't change them loudly. The moments that actually matter tend to arrive without announcement. The team was 3 hours into the morning's movement when Sloan noticed Calloway. He was behind her by 20 feet, and something was wrong with the way he was moving. Not dramatically wrong, not stumbling or falling behind, but wrong in the way a well-calibrated instrument begins to give imprecise readings before it fails entirely. His step selection was slightly off. He was choosing the easier line too consistently. His response time on terrain transitions was a half-second slower than it had been the day before. She let 2 more minutes pass. She watched Calloway navigate a short uphill section and saw him pause at the top, not to observe but to collect himself. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds. Nobody else noticed. She called a brief equipment check. Routine. Everyone accepted it as routine. While the team adjusted gear and drank water, she made her way to Calloway. She did it without appearing to make her way to him. Check Decker's pack first said 3 words about his load distribution, then drifted to Calloway and crouched beside him as if she was checking the ground anchor on her own pack. "How long has the headache been there?" she asked. Quietly, conversational. Calloway looked at her. "What headache?" "The one that's been sitting behind your left eye since approximately 500 this morning." A pause. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're at moderate altitude. You've been underhydrating since yesterday afternoon because the water in your secondary bladder froze overnight and you didn't switch to your primary until late, and your body has been compensating for 3 hours. Your judgment is starting to drift. You don't feel it yet. That's how this works." Calloway stared at her with the particular expression of a man who is simultaneously annoyed and unsure whether he is being insulted or helped. These were sometimes the same thing to Calloway. "Drink 16 ounces before we move," she said. Her voice was level, not soft level. "I'm going to give you something for the vasoconstriction. We check again in 40 minutes. He drank. Not because he believed her necessarily. He drank because something in the way she said it left him without an argument that didn't make him sound like an idiot. 40 minutes later, Calloway was moving correctly again. Step selection precise. Response time sharp. The slight drag in his performance that had been building for 3 hours was gone. Rourke had watched the exchange from a distance. He hadn't heard what was said. He had seen what happened, which was that Sloan had identified a problem. Nobody else noticed, handled it without drama, and the problem had resolved. He filed this away in the part of his mind that kept track of things that mattered. That evening, Hargrove found her running through her medical kit inventory, a nightly ritual she performed with the focused efficiency of a pilot running pre-flight checks. "Good catch today," he said. Sloan didn't look up from the kit. "Textbook presentation," she said. "Easy to miss when you're moving." Calloway would have been a real problem by tomorrow morning. Yes. Hargrove stood there for a moment. In the way of certain experienced men, he understood that the quality of a person is often most visible in what they don't do with a moment of validation. Sloan didn't do anything with it. She kept checking her kit. He nodded once, turned, and went back inside. Day 5 arrived with a stillness that felt intentional. No wind, temperature at -44 and flat. The sky was a gray-white sheet pulled tight from horizon to horizon, and the snow on the ground had the compressed, flinty quality it gets when the cold has been working at it long enough. The team made camp on a broad shelf of ground below a ridgeline that ran north-northeast, the kind of position that offered good overhead cover and a clean view of the approach from the south. While the others set shelter and arranged equipment with the routine competence of men who had done this enough times to make it nearly automatic, Sloan walked to the northern edge of the shelf and sat down in the snow. She wasn't looking at the view. She wasn't resting. She was looking at the ridge that rose above them, at the way it ran, at the places where it exposed itself against the sky, at the specific geometry of the terrain features along its face. Her eyes moved the way her father had taught her eyes to move, not at the target, but at everything between here and the target. Wind, light, ground texture. The mathematics of distance made visible in the landscape itself. Master Sergeant Dale Mercer, United States Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance. 21 years of service. He had come home from places he never described and had spent the years afterwards standing behind his daughter on hillsides in Montana, his hands on her shoulders, his voice unhurried, telling her things that mattered. He had been teaching her since she was 10. He had been gone for 4 years. She did not think his name when she read terrain. She did not need to. The knowledge was in her hands and in her eyes and in the quiet interior where certain things live after they have been practiced long enough to become permanent. Cole settled into the snow 6 feet to her right, with the unhurried ease of a man who has spent decades being uncomfortable outdoors and has long since made his peace with it. He was holding a cup of something hot, and he looked at the ridge for a while the way you look at something you've looked at many times before and still find worth looking at. He didn't speak first. Neither did she. Several minutes passed in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "What are you ranging?" Cole said finally. "The northern face," she said. "The exposed section about halfway up. Wind coming across it from the northwest at 12 to 15, but there's a secondary eddy off that rock feature at the top. Probably add 3 to 4 degrees of unpredictability in the last third of the distance." Cole looked at the rock feature she was describing. It was barely visible, a slight irregularity in the ridge silhouette at a significant distance. You would need to know what to look for. "What are you putting the distance at?" he said. 1180, give or take 20. Cole drank from his cup. 1165, he said. Sloan looked at the ridge again, adjusted her estimate for the flat light compression effect at this range. 1168, she said. Cole made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Close enough," he said. He stood and walked back toward the camp. At the shelter entrance, he paused beside Decker and said something quietly. Decker looked toward Sloan, then quickly looked away as if he hadn't meant to look. Sloan stayed where she was for another few minutes. Then she stood, brushed the snow from her pants with 2 practiced strokes, and went back to check her medical kit. That night, after the camp was settled and the first watch rotation arranged, Calloway sat across from Decker near the shelter's small heat source. "You notice anything about the dock today?" Decker said, keeping his voice down. Calloway was working a compass housing that needed tightening. He didn't look up. "She's observant," he said. The word came out neutral, a fact being placed on a table for examination. "She was ranging that ridge, not casually, like precisely." Calloway tightened the housing one more turn. "She's a corpsman," he said firmly. "She's here for the med kit. Let's stay in our lanes." Decker nodded and said nothing else. Across the shelter, Hargrove lay on his side with his eyes closed. He was not asleep. He had been hearing everything for 20 years, and he had learned to do most of his important thinking with his eyes closed so that people would leave him alone to do it. He thought about what Decker had seen. He thought about what he himself had seen, the economy of motion when Sloan moved through her medical kit, the absence of wasted gesture, the way her body sometimes paused for a fraction of a second before a completely routine physical task, the pause of someone suppressing an instinct before allowing a visible action to replace it. He thought about the moment on day 1 when Sloan had reached across the table for the terrain map, and her right hand had passed over Rourke's M4 sitting in its rack. The hand had not stopped, it had not trembled, but the fingers had adjusted a millimeter's worth of movement, gone so fast it barely existed, and then returned to neutral. Muscle memory is a particular kind of knowledge. It lives below language, below consciousness, below the places where a person decides who they are going to be. It is the body remembering something the mind is trying to forget. Hargrove filed everything away. Outside, the wind began again across the Brooks Range, that long, unbroken push, moving through a landscape that had been here since before human beings had the idea of measuring things and would be here long after they gave it up. 5 days of the patrol remained. Neither Calloway nor Decker nor Rourke nor Hargrove knew yet what those 5 days were going to ask of any of them. Neither did Sloan. She was lying on her side in the dark, her hand near, but not touching her medical kit, her breathing slow and measured. Her eyes were open. She was looking at the wall of the shelter, and she was thinking about a ridge in the Brooks Range and the way the wind would come off it in certain conditions, and what a person would need to account for down to the last detail to make a shot from their count. She told herself it was just the way her mind worked. She closed her eyes. She tried to sleep. The 7th day began like the others, cold air pressing down on cold ground. The team moving at first light through a landscape that offered no warmth and no sympathy. No indication that this morning was different from any other morning. The difference was that this morning they were moving towards something, not through terrain, but toward a specific point. A supply route the intelligence assessment had flagged as active. A narrow valley passage between 2 ridgelines where the physical geography made avoidance nearly impossible if you were moving equipment in bulk. Rourke wanted eyes on it directly. He wanted fact, not inference. The movement to the observation point took 2 hours. They reached it at 0840 and settled in, and they watched. For 3 hours, nothing happened. This is the part of the work that nobody talks about, the hours of nothing, the compression of time that happens when you are cold and still and waiting for something that may not come. Sloan lay in the snow above the valley, and she waited, and she was patient, and the valley was quiet and white and still. Then it wasn't. The first shot came from the eastern ridge. A single crack, clean and distant, the way a shot sounds when it comes from far enough away that you hear the bullet before you hear the weapon. Decker dropped. Not fell drop, the specific way a body falls when the nervous system receives information it cannot process, and the legs stop receiving instructions. He was down before the echo finished. Sloan covered the 8 feet between her position and Decker in a low scrambling movement that keeps the profile below the sight line, and she put her hands on him and she started working. Left thigh, high. The entry wound was small and dark, and the blood was the wrong color, too bright, too arterial, moving with a pressure that told her everything she needed to know in under 3 seconds. The femoral artery, the largest artery in the leg. When it is compromised, the body can lose enough blood to cause unconsciousness in 90 seconds. It can lose enough to cause death in under 3 minutes. These are not statistics. They are the only facts in the world when your hands are on someone and the clock is already running. She had the cat tourniquet out before she finished the assessment. Generation 7. She worked the loop over his boot and up the legs, cinched it, twisted, the windlass counted turns, locked it, noted the time. Decker was making a compressed, involuntary sound that men make when the pain is too large for language. "You're okay," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "I have you. Don't move." A second shot from the eastern ridge hit the snow 2 feet to her left. She did not flinch. She checked the tourniquet seal and applied direct pressure above it with her left palm, and she stayed in position. The team was returning fire. But the shooter on the eastern ridge had a position. The terrain was protecting a natural rock formation that provided cover from direct fire and elevation that made approach by any of the team's current positions geometrically impossible. Every angle exposed someone to the ridgeline. The team was pinned. Decker was losing time in a very direct and arithmetic sense, and the shooter on that ridge was making it impossible to move him. Rourke read the situation completely instantly without sentiment. He looked at the ridge, he ran the geometry. He came to the same conclusion twice in 2 seconds. "I need that position cleared," he said. "Clear and direct the way commands work when everyone has been trained to receive them. Now, anybody with a clean angle." Nobody had a clean angle. The Barrett M82A1 was lying in the snow 4 feet from Sloan's left hand. It had belonged to their long-range reconnaissance element who had taken a hit to the shoulder and was down behind cover on the far side of the position. 30 pounds of precision-engineered steel chambered in .50 caliber BMG, the round designed to stop vehicle engines, to punch through reinforced barriers, is to reach across distances that smaller calibers treat as theoretical. Sloan looked at the rifle. She looked at the eastern ridge. Distance approximately 780 meters. Elevation differential positive 43 meters above her current position. Wind northwest at 9 to 11 miles per hour, with a secondary shift caused by the valley's channeling effect that would push the bullet slightly right to left in the final 200 meters. Temperature negative 47, which meant the powder charge would be operating at reduced efficiency, which meant she needed to compensate for more bullet drop than the scope's default settings would account for. All of this assembled itself in under 4 seconds. She pressed harder on Decker's thigh with her left hand. She looked at him directly. "I need you to hold this." She took his right hand and placed it over the pressure point. "Press here. Don't let go. Can you do that?" Decker's face was white and tight and wet with the effort of containing what he was feeling, but his eyes were focused. He pressed down. "Good," Sloan said. "Don't let go." She reached left and picked up the Barrett. The rifle was cold enough that the metal pulled slightly at the skin of her palm through her glove liner. She adjusted the bipod. She settled the stock into her right shoulder. She aligned her eye with the scope. The world through the scope was a different world. Magnified, clarified, narrowed to what mattered. She found the rock formation. She found the gap. She found the elevated position from which the shots were coming, and she placed the crosshairs and she breathed. 4 counts in. Hold. 8 counts out. Her heart rate was elevated from the movement and the adrenaline of the last 4 minutes. She needed it lower. She needed it below 70 before she broke the shot. She breathed and she let the crosshairs settle, and she waited for the moment between heartbeats when the body is neither expanding nor contracting, when everything is as close to motionless as a living system can be. She found the still point. She broke the shot. The Barrett fired with a recoil that would have dislocated the shoulder of someone who didn't know it was coming. She absorbed it through the whole structure of her body, not fighting it, letting it move through her and out. She worked the bolt. She reacquired the position through the scope. The shot had hit 8 inches right of center. She had overcorrected for the valley wind and undercorrected for velocity loss at this temperature. She knew this before she finished the assessment because she had already done the math again faster this time with the data the first shot had given her. She adjusted. She breathed. She found the still point. She broke the second shot. In the scope, she saw what she needed to see. The position went quiet. Sloan set the Barrett down in the snow. She turned back to Decker. She moved his hand and checked the tourniquet, checked the wound, checked his color, his pupils, his respiratory rate. The bleeding was controlled. The tourniquet was holding. His pulse was fast but present. "Still with me," she said. "Yeah." His voice was thin, but there. "Good." She began preparing the next phase of care. Her hands were steady. The same hands that had just operated a .50 caliber precision rifle across 780 meters of frozen Alaska Valley were now moving through the contents of a medical kit with the same focused economy, the same absence of wasted motion. Behind her, in the sudden quiet that follows the cessation of fire, the team registered what had happened. Calloway said 3 words that were not a sentence and were not a question, and that did not require a response. He said them into the cold air of the valley as if speaking to the landscape itself, because the landscape was the only thing large enough to hold what he was trying to express. Rourke said nothing. He looked at Sloane's back as she worked on Decker. He looked at the Barrett lying in the snow beside her. He looked at the eastern ridge, which was still and quiet in a way that left no doubt about the permanence of what had just happened there. Then he said, "Move. We need to get Decker to the shelter." They moved fast. The team consolidated, and they made the shelter in 40 minutes, which was faster than the terrain should have allowed because everyone was running on the particular energy the body reserves for the hours immediately following danger. Sloan worked on Decker throughout the movement. At the shelter, she reevaluated the tourniquet, confirmed it was holding arterial pressure, repacked the wound with hemostatic gauze, and established a saline lock for fluid access. She ran a full assessment with the systematic focus of someone for whom this was the only thing happening in the world. When she was satisfied with his stability, she sat back on her heels and peeled off her outer gloves and flexed her hands twice. Then she put the gloves back on and began inventorying what she had used. Rourke crouched beside her. He waited until she had finished the inventory. He was a man who understood the importance of not interrupting work when the work mattered, and he had watched enough of Sloane's work over 7 days to understand that it always mattered. "Where did that come from?" he said. Sloane was writing in her small field notebook. She finished the line she was writing, then she capped her pen. She closed the notebook. She looked at Rourke with the same gray-green eyes. She looked at everything with steady level, giving away exactly what she wanted to give away, and nothing more. "My father," she said. Rourke waited. The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. Sloane didn't say anything else. Rourke held the silence for another moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man who has asked what he is entitled to ask and received what he is entitled to receive, and stood and moved to check the team's positions. Calloway was on the far side of the shelter, not looking at Sloane, looking at the wall. He had the expression of a man reorganizing something interior, something that had been filed under one heading for a long time and now needed to go somewhere else. Decker turned his head and found Sloane. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words were very quiet and very direct, and came from a place that had no room for anything decorative. Sloane was already moving to her kit. "Rest," she said. "Drink when I tell you to drink." That night, the cold deepened. It moved below -50 and kept going, and the shelter held the team's collective warmth with the fragile competence of all temporary structures, adequate but aware of its own limits. The wind had picked up in the late afternoon and was moving across the ridge above them in long layered sweeps that occasionally found the shelter's seams and reminded everyone inside that the warmth they were experiencing was conditional. Hargrove found Sloane outside. She was sitting 10 feet from the shelter entrance, facing north with her back against a snow berm she had built to block the direct wind. From a distance in the dark, she would have been nearly invisible, just a shape against the white, not moving, not making a sound. Hargrove sat down beside her without asking permission and without ceremony. He sat and let her make the decision about whether she wanted company. She didn't move away. He reached into his inner chest pocket and brought out an envelope, standard white, worn at the corners from being carried a long time in a place close to the body. He held it out. Sloane looked at it without moving for a moment. Then she looked at Hargrove. "Where did you get that?" she said. "Your CO at Lewis McCord," Hargrove said, "before we deployed. He asked me to carry it. He said you'd been carrying the original in your ruck for 4 years, and that you had a habit of running toward the things you were afraid of instead of opening them." Sloane said nothing. "He was a good man," Hargrove said. "Your CO, he said your father was a better one." The wind moved across the ridge above them. Sloane took the envelope. She turned it over once. The writing on the front was her name in a hand she would have recognized anywhere angular. Economical, the handwriting of a man who had never believed in wasting motion, even in letters. She opened it. The paper inside had been folded in thirds, the way military men fold things, precise and habitual. She unfolded it in the shelter of her body out of the wind. The handwriting was the same as it had always been. The letter was not long. Her father had not been a man of long letters. He had been a man of precision, and precision is the enemy of length. He wrote that he was sorry for the timing. He wrote that 2 weeks was not enough notice for the things he wanted to say, but that he had never been good at saying them earlier when there was more time, because more time had always felt like a reason to wait. He wrote that he had heard what she promised her mother and that he understood why she made the promise and that he had never asked her to make that promise and would never have asked her to keep it. Then he wrote this: he had taught her to shoot because he had wanted her to be capable. He had taught her to be capable because he had seen what happened to people who weren't in places he had been, in circumstances he hoped she would never face but suspected she might. He had taught her everything he knew, not so that she could decide to use it, but so that when the moment came where using it was the only remaining option, she would be ready. Capability is not the same as intention. A person can be capable of a thing and choose never to do it, and that is a legitimate choice, often the best choice. But the capability itself, the readiness, the knowledge, the trained body, and the trained mind, that was something he had wanted to give her, the way other fathers give their children the tools they will need for the specific work of their lives. He wrote, "I never wanted you to be a weapon. I wanted you to be complete." He wrote, "You are the best thing I ever made my hands do." At the bottom, a single sentence: "When it counts, you will know what to do." You already know. You have always known. Sloan read the letter twice. Then she folded it along the original creases, 3 precise folds, and put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope inside her inner chest pocket against her body, in the place where it had been writing for 4 years in a different form. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were level. She stayed exactly where she was for another 5 minutes, breathing slowly, letting the cold settle around her, and the letter settle into her, and the night settle around both of them. Hargrove sat beside her and said nothing. After a while, he stood. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, not a gesture of comfort, exactly more, the gesture of one person acknowledging another person's reality. Then he went back inside. Sloan sat for a few more minutes in the dark, then she followed him in. Day 8 passed in the necessary work of monitoring Decker and reassessing the team's position following the contact. Rourke made the call to maintain the observation objective where possible while managing Decker's condition, which had moved from critical to serious, to stable over the course of the evening and through the night. Sloan had been awake for most of those hours. Nobody asked her to be. She simply was. The wound was controlled under tourniquet pressure, but Decker had no vascular surgery, no operating table, nothing that could address the underlying damage. He was stabilized, not repaired. That was the honest word for what she had been able to do for him, and she used honest words when she assessed her patients, always because honest words tell you what you still need to do. He could bear weight on flat ground with full support on both sides. He could not manage broken terrain independently. He would need Callaway on his right and someone rotating on his left for the 2-mile movement to the LZ, and the pace would reflect this, and Rourke had already incorporated all of it into his planning without being told, because Rourke incorporated everything into his planning without being told. In the early hours of day 8, Callaway passed through the shelter on his watch rotation and saw Sloan awake and checking Decker's wound site. He stood there for a moment in the dark, then he went back to his position. In the morning, without being asked, he brought her a cup of water. She accepted it without comment. He walked away without comment. In the economy of the situation, this was a significant transaction. By day 8's end, Decker was moving short distances, carefully. His leg was not what it had been and would not be for some time, but the alternative, which Sloan had made clear to anyone who asked, and to several people who hadn't, had been measured in minutes on day 7 afternoon. Day 9 came cold and purposeful, the final day of the active patrol phase. One remaining objective before the team began moving toward the extraction point, a position on the northern approach to the valley that controlled the route they needed to use for withdrawal. It was occupied. The terrain made the options set narrow. Narrow meant one option. The target position was on the far ridgeline. Rourke assessed it through his scope for a long time without speaking. Then he gave the distance at 1,140 meters and looked at Sloan. He started to say something. He stopped himself. Then he said, "Doc, you don't have to." Sloan was already lying down. She had found her position before he finished speaking, a natural depression in the snow shelf that provided the right combination of stability and sightline with a clean angle to the northern ridge. She had the Barrett against her shoulder and her eyes eyed to the scope, and she was doing what she always did, which was calculate. 1,150 meters. She marked the slight difference from Rourke's estimate and filed it. Elevation differential, positive 61 meters above the valley floor. Temperature negative 52 colder than day 7, which meant further velocity reduction, further compensation required for bullet drop. Wind 35 miles per hour from the northwest with the same valley channeling effects she had encountered before, but stronger now because the weather system that had been building for 2 days was beginning to make itself felt. At this distance, the wind would push the bullet more than 15 inches at moderate speed, and more than that at the gust intervals she was already tracking, with her eyes watching the snow surface at the 400-meter mark to read the timing before the gusts reached the target, and her right shoulder. She had not said anything about her shoulder to anyone. A fragment small from the near miss on day 7 had embedded in the outer muscle during the contact. She had cleaned the wound herself that evening and dressed it and said nothing because it was not functionally debilitating and because saying something would have produced a conversation she did not have time for. The shoulder worked. It hurt. These were two separate facts, and only the first one mattered for what came next. She settled the stock into her right shoulder. She absorbed the pressure against the wound without reaction. She breathed. Calloway had moved to a position 6 feet behind and to her left. He was watching. Not supervising, watching the way you watch something when you are trying to understand it, when you are revising your understanding of something in real time and want to see it clearly. He had been shooting at distance for 12 years. He understood what he was watching. He understood the calculation it required and the discipline it required, in the particular stillness at the center of it, the capacity to remove yourself from the urgency of the moment and operate in a different register entirely where time moves differently. And the only things that exist are the crosshairs and the wind and the math. He had never seen anyone do it quite this way. He had thought he was one of the best at it. He watched Sloan Mercer, and he revised this understanding quietly and completely. She waited for the interval between gusts. She found it. She broke the shot. The rifle moved through her. She stayed with the scope. She saw what she needed to see. She set the Barrett down. She sat up slowly. She rolled her neck once. She stood. Rourke looked at the northern ridge for a long time with his scope. Then he lowered it and looked at Sloan with something that had moved through acknowledgement and arrived somewhere older and more considered, the look of a man who had spent 22 years deciding what people were capable of and had been wrong about this one in a way he was going to be thinking about for a while. Calloway was still behind her. She turned and found him there. His face was doing something complicated, holding two incompatible facts and trying to find the space where they could coexist. He had been trying to form an expression for the last 4 minutes and had not succeeded. He said nothing. Sloan looked at him for one even second. Then she picked up the Barrett and checked the scope for damage from the recoil and found none and set it back down. "We should move," she said. "Decker's going to need help with the first 2 miles." She started toward the shelter to collect her medical kit. Behind her, Calloway watched her go. He gave up on the expression. He started moving to help break down the camp. The extraction window was 6 minutes. Rourke had confirmed it twice with the pilot before they broke camp, and the pilot had said it both times with the flat certainty of someone who has spent years flying in Alaskan winter and has stopped softening the arithmetic of weather for the comfort of the people who need to hear it. 6 minutes from skids down to liftoff. What the pilot did not need to say, because the sky said it clearly enough, was that once the system moving in from the northwest moved through, it would not release the range for a minimum of 36 hours. There would be no second window until it passed. Anyone on the ground when it closed would stay on the ground until it chose to open again. They began moving toward the landing zone at 1340. The LZ was a broad shelf of compressed snow 2 miles northeast of the final observation position. 2 miles over this terrain under normal conditions was manageable. With Decker, it was something else. The tourniquet had controlled the bleeding, and Sloan had done everything a corpsman could do without an operating table, but 48 hours without vascular surgery meant his left leg had been managed, not repaired. He could bear weight for short distances on flat ground with support on both sides, but over broken snow terrain, in full kit, he needed Calloway on his right and someone rotating on his left, and the pace reflected this. Sloan stayed close, monitoring his color, monitoring his breathing, reading the signs she had been trained to read. They were making time. The terrain cooperated through the first mile, a gradual descent through open ground with manageable cover and wind that was strong, but not yet dangerous. The sky above the range had the gray-yellow quality that experienced winter travelers learn to recognize as the light that precedes a significant weather event. Cole read it once, looked at Rourke, said nothing. Rourke had already seen it. They picked up pace. It was Sloane who saw it first. She was moving to Decker's left, her eyes in their habitual pattern of ground to middle to far, when she registered the western slope, a section where the snow surface was wrong, not disturbed by wind or settling, but disturbed in the way snow gets disturbed by a person who has moved through it and tried not to leave a sign. She stopped. Her hand went out and caught Decker's arm without looking at him. He stopped. She had the binoculars out before she finished the calculation. Through them, she found it a shape that was not a rock and not a snow formation. A thermal mass the size and approximate configuration of a human being partially collapsed against the base of a boulder formation at the edge of a natural hollow in the slope. Not moving, she keyed her radio. Rourke, possible civilian contact. Western slope 200 meters bearing 270. A 3-second pause. Confirmed visual binoculars, shape is consistent with a person down. No movement in the last 40 seconds. Another pause. Shorter. What's your read? Not military. Body position is wrong for tactical down. Consistent with immobility from cold or injury. He's been there a while. The wind increased. The MH-60 was 12 minutes out. The L's was just over a mile ahead. 6-minute window, Rourke said. We're at the edge of our time. I know, Sloane said. The silence on the radio lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when you are counting them. I can't hold the bird, Doc. I know, she said again. She was already moving. She handed Decker to Calloway without ceremony, transferring his left arm from her shoulder to Calloway's. In the efficient, zero-waste way, she transferred everything. She turned west and started across the slope. She heard Rourke's voice behind her even, and controlled the voice of a man who understood that giving an order and being able to enforce it are sometimes different things, and that the difference is most visible in people who operate from a sense of purpose rather than a sense of command. 200 meters, he said, not a command, a limit. She moved across the slope. The figure against the boulder was a man. She had the age at 60-something before she reached him. He was on his left side with his right arm extended and his gloved fingers partially open, as if he had last been trying to reach something that wasn't there. Civilian cold weather gear quality equipment, but not Arctic rated, the kind of professional who works outdoors buys, because it is good rather than because it is designed for conditions that kill within minutes. She found the pulse first. It was there. Slow and thready, but there. She found his identification in his outer vest pocket. Geological survey. His name was Everett, an emergency contact in Fairbanks with the same last name. She assessed him while she transmitted. Civilian, male mid-60s, hypothermia stage 2 approaching 3. Right ankle fibula fracture. He's been immobile at minimum 12 hours. He cannot walk. Rourke's voice came back immediately. Doc, I need your status. She looked at the man on the ground. She looked at the sky. She looked back in the direction of the team. She keyed the radio. Get the team to the LZ. Get Decker on that bird. He needs a surgical consult within hours. I'll manage here. Sloane. It was the first time Rourke had used her first name in 10 days. Get Decker on that bird, she said. I'll manage here. The radio was quiet for 8 seconds. Then, I'm calling your position into base. They will come back for you at first weather window. Copy, she said. She clipped the radio back to her chest and began working on Everett. 30 seconds later, moving to adjust his position for warming procedures, her right foot came down wrong on a buried rock. She went down hard on her left side. The radio antenna mounted at her left shoulder hit the boulder directly. She heard the housing crack. She keyed the radio. Static. She adjusted the channel. Static. She removed the antenna housing and assessed the damage the feed connector had sheared at the base. No field repair available with what she had. She put the radio away. She looked at the sky. The gray-yellow light was deepening toward gray-white. The cloud base was lowering visibly, not gradually, but in steps the way it lowers in the 30 minutes before a significant system moves through. She turned back to Everett. There was work to do. Rourke made 4 radio calls. The first was immediate on the team frequency before he had moved 20 steps from where he had last spoken to Sloane. He got static. He called again. Static again. He kept moving toward the LZ because stopping would not help her, and because Decker needed the bird, and because the work of command sometimes requires you to continue moving in one direction when every instinct you have is pointing in another, and you carry the weight of that with you and you do not put it down. He made the second call to the pilot updating the situation. The pilot acknowledged. He made the third call to base transmitting Sloane's last known coordinates and the civilian contact and the antenna damage, and everything else a person on the ground would need to plan a return. The MH-60 lifted at 1547. By 1800, the weather system had closed the Brooks Range completely. Cloud base dropped to 200 feet. Wind gusts exceeded 60 miles per hour across the northern slopes. At Yeltsin, the operations center marked Sloan's last known coordinates on the board and put a weather hold on all flight operations. The meteorologist's estimate delivered without apology 36 hours minimum, possibly longer. Rourke stood at the ops board for a long time after the briefing. He did the math. She had gone into the field at approximately 1400. If the window opened at first light, 2 mornings out, 0700. At the earliest, that was 17 hours past the first morning. 31 hours total from when she stopped answering the radio. He had looked at colder numbers in his career. None of them had felt like this one. He did not close his eyes that night. He sat with his hands on his knees and he calculated everything: the weather timeline, the return window, the coordinates, the gear she had given away across 10 days of patrol. He ran the numbers without sentiment, looking at what they said. The numbers did not say what he needed them to say. The temperature dropped below -60 at 1800 and kept going. Sloan was aware of this the way you are aware of things you cannot change but need to track, because tracking them is the only honest relationship available to you. She was aware of it in her extremities. First the toes, which had been cold since day 3 and were now approaching a different category of cold, and in the muscles of her face, which were working harder than usual to maintain the seal of her balaclava against the wind. She had stabilized Everett. She had told him her name. She had told him where he was and what had happened and what she was going to do. She did this not because she was certain he could hear her, but because the alternative, treating him as an object to be managed rather than a person to be attended to, was not something she was capable of. He had a wife in Fairbanks. The card said so. Sloan had looked at this information and had decided in the specific way she made decisions when the facts were clear that Everett was going to see his wife again. This was not a feeling, it was a decision. A commitment made to information on a laminated card, in the kind of cold where you find out what your commitments are actually made of. She built a snow trench the way she had been taught: depth first, then width, 3 feet down, before hitting permafrost walls compressed and packed with the efficiency of someone who had practiced this until it was better than good enough. She arranged Everett in the trench with his back against the western wall, which gave the most protection from the prevailing wind. She layered insulation beneath him first because ground conduction kills faster than ambient cold. The physics of heat loss do not negotiate. She gave him all of it, every heat pack in her medical kit, the emergency thermal blanket from her outer pack, her mid-weight fleece, the insulation layer she had been wearing under her shell. She removed it in the 12 seconds it takes to remove a garment when the decision is final. She folded it with 3 precise folds and placed it across his core. She kept her outer shell. She kept her base layer. She kept her balaclava and her gloves. She kept the beret. She laid it along her body in the trench because in a survival situation without landmarks and without light, a long, rigid object laid parallel to the body provides orientation information you cannot get any other way. If snow covers the trench, if darkness becomes total, the rifle is north, or it is the direction you chose when you placed it, which becomes north by decision, and a direction chosen and committed to is better than a direction lost. She did not light a fire. She had the means to. She chose not to. She did not know with certainty that no one was still in the area, and a thermal signature visible from distance in an otherwise cold landscape is a target with no other meaning. She weighed the warmth against the risk. The risk won. She arranged herself in the trench beside Everett, and she controlled her breathing, and she began to count. Keep the mind working. Give it specific work with a right answer at the end. Numbers, names, sequences. The moment you allow approximation, the mind begins to accept approximation about larger things, and larger things are not forgiving. She had learned this on a cold Montana night at 13, lying in a field while her father talked in the unhurried way. He talked about things that mattered not as lessons, just as truth spoken aloud into the dark. She had not understood all of it then. She understood all of it now. She counted her cases, not abstractly, specifically. The name of every patient she had treated in 4 years of service, in the order she had treated them, from the first week of deployment to the most recent contact. She counted their injuries, and she counted her interventions, and she counted the outcomes. She kept the numbers precise because precision was the point. The mind had to work. The work had to be real. She counted 41 names before the first hour was gone. She timed the wind gusts at the lip of the trench by the sound they made against the Barrett's scope, housing a specific tone at specific velocities. She estimated velocity from tone and tracked the pattern and filed it. She estimated the distance the weather system had traveled since 1800 by the change in gust intervals, which narrows as a system consolidates, and she calculated its likely position at 0200 and at 0600 and at 0800. In the 16th hour, her core temperature dropped below the threshold at which the body begins to make its negotiations. She recognized it in the quality of her thinking, not in the loss of thought, but in the slight increase in the effort. Thinking required the way a car feels different when it is running on less fuel. She noted it and gave her mind harder work to do. She thought about the northern ridge, 1,168 meters. She rebuilt the shot from the beginning. The wind, the temperature, the elevation differential, the specific quality of light through the scope. She rebuilt the first shot on day 7, the one that had missed by 8 inches. She thought about what her father would have said. He would have said, "You corrected." He would have said it the way he said things when he was satisfied briefly flatly with the particular economy of a man who had decided that his approval was worth something and therefore would not devalue it with excess. She held his voice in her mind. She kept counting. Beside her, in the accumulated warmth of the heat packs and the thermal blanket and the fleece she had given him, Everett's breathing was regular and even. When she checked him by touch, the temperature and texture of his face, the moisture on his lips, he had stabilized. He was not improving. He was not deteriorating. He was held in place by everything she had given him, and holding was enough. At some point in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the temperature outside the trench had reached negative 71 degrees Fahrenheit and was holding there in the flat and indifferent way of extreme cold that has found its level, Sloane's right hand moved along the length of the Barrett and found the grip. She held it the way she held it because it was the thing that was there, the object that was simultaneously the most technical expression of everything her father had given her and the most direct connection to the moment on day 7 when she had picked it up without thinking and done what needed to be done. She held it and she breathed and she counted names in the dark. Outside, the Brooks Range held the cold, the way it always held, the cold absolutely without negotiation, with the complete indifference of a landscape that predates the human capacity for suffering and will outlast it. The night lasted a very long time. The light that reached the trench came in thin and at a low angle. It was the second morning since she had gone in. The weather system had held the range for 30 hours before releasing it, and she estimated by the quality of the light and the temperature she had tracked through the night that it was somewhere between 7:30 and 8:30. 31 hours. She had been counting. She opened her eyes and moved her fingers and her toes in sequence and took stock. Right shoulder significant. The wound had bled again through the hours of cold. Mobility at approximately 60%. Functional. Left hand sensation reduced in the index and middle finger frostbite. Onset early stage manageable with controlled rewarming. Core temperature, she could not measure it precisely, but she was thinking clearly and moving voluntarily, and her heart rate was elevated but present and regular. These were the relevant indicators. Everett was breathing. She checked him by touch and found him stable, cooler than she wanted, warmer than she had feared. She thought the cold that tries to kill you is also the cold that preserves you if you know what to do with it. Her father had told her this. Not about survival, specifically about everything. The things that are hard and also the things that make you. The same force. Different relationship. She worked her hand free of the Barrett's grip. She flexed it 3 times. She began working the feeling back into her left fingers. She heard them before she saw them. Sound travels in interesting ways through snow, sometimes dampened, sometimes channeled, depending on density and depth. The sound that reached her was muffled but rhythmic. Boots in snow. More than one person. Moving with the direction and spacing of people who are searching rather than traveling. She sat up as much as the trench allowed and reached above her head and pushed upward against the snow lid. The lid gave. She pushed harder, and the snow fell away, and the gray-white light of a Brooks Range morning came down into the trench, and she blinked against it, and she looked up. Rourke was looking down at her. He was on one knee in the snow, his weight forward, and he had found the trench the way she would have found it herself, reading the surface compression, the slight irregularity of accumulation over a subsurface space. He had found it the same way she had found Everett's position on the western slope. He looked down at her, and his face did something it was not accustomed to doing, a significant rearrangement of features that had been set in a specific configuration for a very long time. He put his hand down into the trench. She took it. Behind him, she could see the team Callaway 2 SEAL medics from the base Hargrove Cole at the perimeter. They had spread in the open area around the trench in the way trained people spread out, covering angles, maintaining awareness. But the quality of their attention was directed inward, toward the trench, toward what Rourke had found. Callaway was standing very still. His arms were at his sides. He was looking at the hand she had extended from the trench at the Barrett, still in it, at the grip of it, 5 fingers locked around the stock, in a hold that had not released through 31 hours of temperatures that make metal brittle and silence permanent. His face was doing the complicated thing again. It had been doing it since the moment the medic who first reached the trench had looked up at the rest of the team and said what he had said. Rourke pulled her up. She came out of the trench in sections, the hand first, then the head and shoulders, then the rest of her cold and stiff and moving with the careful deliberateness of a body that has been doing the most fundamental work of existence for 31 hours and is only now being told that the work is done. She stood in the snow beside the trench. She was still holding the Barrett. Rourke steadied her with one hand at her arm. He said nothing. She looked at the team around her. She looked at Callaway. "Everett needs immediate transport," she said. Her voice was rougher than usual, the rough quality of a voice preserved by cold rather than rested. "Hypothermia stage 2 minimum, right fibula fracture, controlled rewarming, only no rapid heating. Tell whoever receives him." "We have it," Rourke said. "He needs warm fluids, the 35-degree protocol." "Sloan." His voice was quiet. "We have it." She stopped. She looked at him. She allowed herself one full breath of cold air, let it out slowly. "Okay," she said. The medics moved past her to the trench to Everett, and she listened to the sounds of them working, and she allowed herself to not be the person working, and this was the hardest part of the morning. The field hospital at Ihilson was warm in the way of places made warm by direct effort, rather than design the deliberate warmth of heaters and insulation and closed doors, a warmth that felt specific and chosen. After 31 hours in negative 71, it felt like a physical statement. Sloan was in the bed nearest the window. She had been there for 2 hours. She had cooperated with the medical team with the precise minimal cooperation of a patient who knows exactly what is being done to her and why, which made her efficient and occasionally frustrating. The shoulder had been dressed properly. The left hand had been rewarmed in stages using the correct protocol, which she had confirmed twice, because she found it difficult to be on the receiving end of medical care without verifying that it was being done correctly. The attending physician had noted this in her chart as highly engaged patient. She was looking at the window when Rourke came in. He sat down in the chair at the side of the bed, without asking permission and without ceremony. He had been awake for as long as she had been in the trench, plus the flight to the LZ, plus the return mission. He looked at his eyes, had the quality of eyes running on something other than sleep for a long time. He sat with his hands on his knees for a moment. "Everett is going to make it," he said. "His wife is on her way from Fairbanks." Sloan looked at the window. "Good," she said. "I lost your signal at 200 meters, Rourke said. "The antenna, I know." "If I had known, you put Decker on the bird," she said. "That was the right call." She said it evenly, without accusation and without absolution. A statement of operational fact. He had made the right decision with the information he had. This did not make the night in the trench not happen. Both things were true simultaneously, and she had made her peace with both of them before the first hour was out. Rourke looked at her for a long time. He had the expression of a man who had prepared a sentence and decided the sentence was inadequate. He reached into the chest pocket of his field jacket. He brought out his trident pin, the gold surface worn at the edges from years of being carried. He placed it on the blanket at her left hand. He didn't make a speech. He didn't explain. He placed it there and left his hand on the blanket beside it for a moment. "Your father would have been proud, Doc," he said. Sloan looked at the pin on the blanket. She looked at the window. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone saying a thing that is true and that they have earned the right to say. "He was Marine Recon, sir," she said. "He'd have told me the shot at 1150 was sloppy, too long on the wind adjustment." For the first time in 10 days, she smiled. It was a small thing. It lasted about 3 seconds. But it was real. Rourke looked at it. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has received something he didn't know he needed. He was almost at the door when it opened from the other side. Callaway stood in the frame. He had cleaned up since the return. But he had the same expression he had been carrying since the moment the snow came off the trench. He looked at Sloan. He stood in the doorframe for 3 full seconds, working at what he wanted to say, because he was not the kind of man who found words quickly in moments that mattered, and this was a moment that mattered. "Doc," he said finally. "Callaway," she said. He nodded, one nod. the kind that carries weight. She returned it. He stepped back from the door. He didn't come in. He didn't need to. The door closed and Sloan was alone with the warmth of the room and the pin on the blanket and the quiet that follows the end of something that has cost a great deal. She picked up the pin. She held it carefully, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. The 22 years behind it, the places it had been, the quality of person it had been attached to and was being given by. She closed her fingers around it. Outside the window, the Brooks Range was doing what it always did, standing against the sky in the way of things that have no interest in being witnessed, but that reward witness regardless. White and enormous and indifferent, and in its indifference, honest in a way that most things are not. She had been in it. She had been in the deepest part of what it was. She was still here. She closed her eyes. She slept. 6 months later, Camp Lejeune was green in the particular way of the Carolina coast in July. Extravagantly, almost aggressively green. The kind of green that seems designed to provide maximum contrast with the memory of white. Sloan stood at the front of a classroom in a building that smelled of institutional coffee and dry erase markers and the specific quality of air that circulates through spaces where people are being taught things that matter. 14 students sat in front of her. Corpsmen, all of them. The youngest was 22, the oldest was 31. They had the look of people who are paying close attention because someone in authority has told them to, but also the look of people who are beginning to suspect that what they are being told might actually be worth paying close attention to. She had gained 8 pounds back. The shadow under her eyes had faded to almost nothing. Her right shoulder moved at 92%, which the surgeon considered an excellent outcome and which she was treating as a working baseline rather than a ceiling. She had been on the phone 3 times with Everett, who had returned to fieldwork in the fall. He had sent her a geological survey map of the Brooks Range with a hand-marked notation at a specific coordinate in a single sentence on the back. "This is where you found me." His wife had sent a card with 2 sentences and her home phone number and an open invitation, the kind that meant it. She had heard from Decker twice, short messages, the messages of a young man not yet sure how to express what he wants to express. She wrote back in kind. He was walking without a limp. The surgery had gone well. He was cleared for limited duty in the spring. She had called her mother in October. It was the first time she had described Alaska in full, the patrol, the contact, on day 7, the night in the trench, Everett. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was not her mother's habit, and which meant she was listening the way she listened when something was too important to risk missing. When Sloan finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Her mother said, "You broke your promise." "Yes," Sloan said. Another pause. "Then your father never wanted you to keep that promise. He wanted me to stop worrying. Those are not the same thing." A breath. "He wanted you to live, Sloan, and he wanted the people around you to live. That is what he was teaching you. I understood that a long time ago. I just needed you to understand it too." Sloan was sitting by the window of her quarters at Lejeune. Outside, the Carolina evening was warm and green and extravagantly ordinary. She held the phone and looked at the light on the leaves and said nothing for a moment. "I think I understand it now," she said. Her mother, "I know you do." She had heard from Hargrove once, a single email, 4 sentences, the economy of a man who had decided everything necessary could be expressed in 4 sentences if the sentences were chosen correctly. He wrote that the integrated medicine curriculum had been formally submitted to the Naval Special Warfare Command Training Review Board. He wrote that Decker had requested assignment to the next corpsman rotation. He wrote that certain people he declined to name had been asking questions about cold weather medical protocol that they had not been asking before. The 4th sentence read, "Some things take time to change, and some things change faster than expected." Both are worth noting. She had written back in 2 sentences. It was enough. She had heard nothing directly from Calloway. But 3 weeks after she had been back at Lejeune, a package arrived at her quarters. No note, no return address. Inside was a field manual for cold weather tactical medicine, the kind the base library kept 3 copies of and rarely checked out. On the inside cover in handwriting she did not recognize, but that had the particular blunt angularity of a man unaccustomed to writing things meant to be read by others. Someone had written 2 words, both hands. She had set it on her desk and looked at it for a while. Then she had put it on the shelf with the other things that mattered. Now she stood at the front of a classroom on a July morning and looked at 14 faces that were paying attention, and she set down the marker she had been holding, and she moved to the front of the desk and stood in front of it rather than behind it, which is a small thing but not an insignificant one. "You are going to spend the next 6 weeks learning 2 things," she said. You are going to learn medicine that works in conditions where medicine is not supposed to be possible. And you are going to learn to function in conditions where everything that is not essential has been removed. She paused. Not everything will be removed at once. Some of it will be taken from you slowly. Some of it will be taken from you all at once, in the middle of the night in a place you did not expect to be. She looked across the 14 faces without hurrying. The job does not ask which kind of removal you prefer. One of the students, the 22-year-old in the second row, had stopped writing. He was looking at her with the expression of someone encountering something they will remember for a long time, not because it is complicated, but because it is true in the specific way that simple things are true when they have been earned rather than inherited. She recognized the expression. She had worn it herself once on a hillside in Montana, standing beside a man who spoke in the unhurried way of someone who understood that the most important things do not require urgency, only attention. You are Navy corpsman, she continued. You are going to spend your career in rooms where someone needs medicine and someone needs a shooter, and you are the only person in the room. The question is not which one you are both. She let this land. The only question that matters in the field in the moment is which one you need to be right now. The room was quiet. She turned to the board. She wrote 3 lines in the same angular, economical hand that her father had used, the hand she had inherited from him, along with the square jaw and the gray-green eyes, in the way of measuring distances without instruments and the knowledge of what to do when everything available has already been used and you are still not done. She wrote, heal when you can. She wrote, fight when you must. She wrote, know the difference. She put the marker down. She let the 3 lines sit. She let the room hold them. In the second row, the 22-year-old looked at the board with the particular stillness of someone who has just received something he did not know he needed. She recognized that too. Outside the window, the Carolina morning was going about its business, warm and green, and full of ordinary life, the kind of life that continues because somewhere in some field or some mountain or some stretch of frozen ground far from anywhere, people have done the work that allows ordinary life to remain ordinary. She looked at the window for 1 second, maybe 2. Then she turned back to the 14 faces. She began.